All right, well, good morning. And good morning to you online. Let me try that again. Good morning. Now, if you're already struggling with sleep, I just want to give you every opportunity to wake up here this morning. I'm looking forward to this. What an opportunity to teach the combined Sunday school class. Last time here this morning before we divide up, go ahead and find Job chapter 25 in your Bibles. Job 25, if you're new to your Bible, that's right before the book of Psalms. Job chapter 25. And you might be relieved to find out that this is the shortest chapter in the book of Job, but then you would lose all hope when I told you we're going to make it through 4 chapters this morning. So Job 25 and verse 1 through 6, we'll just read this chapter to begin our Sunday school hour, and then we'll go from there. Job 25, verse 1 through 6. Then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, Dominion and fear are with him. He maketh peace in his high places. Is there any number of his armies, and upon whom doth not his light arise? How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon, and it shineth not, yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man, that is a worm, and the Son of Man, which is a worm. May God bless the reading of his word. We prayed just a moment ago, and so we're going to go ahead and get into this. You know, as life goes on and progresses, we all identify several issues in life, don't we? Several problems that we all have in life. How many of you all can, now we're not going to ask you for what it is, but how many of you can raise your hand and say, yes, I may be dealing with a problem in my life? Anyone here? Most of you. Brother McClendon doesn't have any problems in life. Oh, okay, it was there. I just didn't see the hand. And maybe those of you that are watching online can identify an issue that you're dealing with as well. We have all kinds of different issues in life that we deal with, don't we? We have health issues. We have financial problems. We have family problems, emotional problems, mental problems. Sometimes we are just fearful of these problems. And fear in and of itself causes more problems. Fear can create problems in our life. Maybe you've been around long enough to know that if you're stressed or fearful and distressed about some things in your life, that the stress will cause you even physical health problems. Problems are real. Job was definitely not foreign to the idea of problems. Of course, in the first 3 chapters, as we talked about weeks ago, we found that Job was probably attacked with more problems all at once than anyone here has ever identified with in their entire lifetime. He lost his wealth. He lost the majority of his family. His relationship with his closest friend, his wife, was totally estranged, and that just went upside down. And then he had 3 of his, what I would imagine to be maybe his closest friends, come and sit down, and here's what they're trying to figure out. With Job's problems, number 1, why did these problems come on Job's life? And secondly, how does Job get out of his problems? All right, so I hate being tethered to the pulpit, so I'm going to switch over to this a little bit. Why, let me give them a chance here. Why did Job have these issues in his life? And secondly, how do you get out of these problems? So if you've identified a problem this morning that you're facing, a struggle of life, then I want to ask you the same 2 questions this morning. Why are you experiencing the problem that you're experiencing today? Why are you in the mess that you're in? And then the second question is this: how do you get out of that problem, right? Because some problems are smaller, and maybe if you've lived life long enough, then you've seen yourself get into trouble or get into some sort of sticky situation and then come out of that sticky situation. Or you've been through what we would call a storm and a trial of life, and you've weathered the storm, right? You come out on the other side. Sometimes those storms change us. Sometimes we just hold fast to who we are and our beliefs, and we refuse to be changed. And so as we've progressed through the book of Job, we've seen from chapter 4 through what's going to end in chapter 25, the three friends of Job have all gone through, Zophar, Elihu, and Bildad, and they've been trying to figure out those two questions for Job. Job, why did this happen to you? And how do you get out of this mess that you're in? And so as we look at the book of Job, I understand this isn't just a story of one of the oldest accounts that we have. This is actually a genuine issue here, and this tackles and deals with the real life problems that we have today. So we get to chapter number 25, and we see Bildad the Shuhite answer Job for one last time. Now, as you may have noticed in your study of Job, in the study of Job, that we've kind of got like a three-ring boxing match going on, it seems like, right? So Elihu says something, and then Bildad fights back, and then Job fights back, and then Bildad attacks Job, and Job gets back at Bildad, and then Zophar, and then Job goes back. So this is the last round. This is it. This is all, they've exhausted their wealth of knowledge. In fact, it's a little obvious here as we look at these these 6 verses in Job 25 that they say nothing new. In fact, what Bildad the Shuhite is about to say is just a restatement of things that Job himself has already said. So let's look at verse number 2. Dominion and fear are with him. He maketh peace in his high places. Is there any number of his armies, and upon whom doth not his light arise? Now, who is Job talking about in these 2 verses? We can go and answer. If you're at home, just scream out the answer and wake up everyone that's sleeping. Who is Job talking about in verse 2 and 3? Anyone want to venture a guess? It's in front of a live audience, so there's plenty of opportunity for embarrassment if you get it wrong, right? He's talking about God. There we go. Thank you. He's talking about God. Primarily, he's talking about the power of God. God has everything under control, and God sees what's going on in all places. Look at verse number 3. Is there any number of his armies? It's impossible, Bildad is saying. Job, it's impossible for you to resist God. The angelic armies of God are always eager and always ready to obey God. So Bildad is saying, Job, resistance is futile. You can't keep on resisting what God has been doing here because God is great in power. Then verse number 4, 5, and 6. How can man be justified with God? He's talking in these last 3 verses of chapter 25 about the justice of God. How then can man be justified with God? Or how can he be clean that is born of a woman? Behold, even to the moon and it shineth not, yea, the stars are not pure in his sight. How much less man that is a worm, and the son of man which is a worm? Listen, Bildad saying, Job, it is impossible for you to be right with God. It's futile. It's pointless. But if you go back to, turn briefly to Job chapter 9, verse number 2. Let's go ahead and give you just a moment to get there. Job 9, verse number 2. Notice what Job says here. Then Job answered and said, in verse number 2, he says this of Job 9, I know it is of a truth, but how should man be just with God? So in this back and forth, we see a lot of things just starting to repeat themselves. It's as if, now we're here, we're all in our Sunday attire, which is great, and I'm standing up here in this suit, but you've got to keep in mind that Job is down here and he's sitting down in a pile of ashes, right? And his friend Bildad and Elihu and Zophar are sitting with them. Maybe they're standing whenever they talk. Some Bible scholars think that by now there's been a crowd that started to gather. And that it's as if there's a line in the sand and the majority of people are on the side of the three friends of Job, and Job is by himself. I don't know if that's true or not. But as Zophar goes through, he's saying, look, Job, there is no way that you are righteous because nobody can be right with God. There's no way that you can resist God because it's futile. There's no number to the armies of God. Remember what they're trying to figure out? Job, why are you in this situation? Job, how do you get out of the situation here? Bildad is saying, Job, just admit that you're guilty and that you're wrong and call upon the mercies of God. Confess your sin, the secret sin that you've done, and ask God to forgive you. But now we see Job's response in chapter 26. Job answered and said, let's just read to verse number 4. How hast thou helped him that is without power? How savest thou the arm that hath no strength? How hast thou counseled him that hath no wisdom? And how hast thou plentifully declared the thing as it is? To whom hast thou uttered words? And whose spirit came from thee, he says. For Bildad to have helped Job, then here's what Job is recognizing, that Bildad's counsel would have needed to come from God if it would have helped him. Because Job is pretty much saying, you've not done anything to help. And here's the problem, that although Bildad said things that were true, just as Job on the other side of the line in the sand has said things that are true, the counsel of Bildad comes from Bildad. All right? I'm going to say that again. The counsel of Bildad, the reason that it did not help Job is because that counsel came from Bildad. It was of his own mind. It was counsel that came not from above, even though there's elements of truth mixed in it, but this counsel came from Bildad himself. And we'll see this as time goes on. Verse number 5 and 6. Dead things are formed from under the waters, and the inhabitants thereof. Hell is naked before him, and destruction hath no covering. God sees everything, even the dead, and Job is saying, look, there's not any place that is hid from the eyes of God. In fact, Job is responding to Bildad and says, even the heavens are made from God here. Look at these incredible scientific claims. Verse number 7. Speaking of God, Job says, he stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. So Job is making a pretty great claim here about some scientific truths, right? And here's what he says, that earth is hung upon nothing. He also says that the clouds are not rent or torn under the weight of the rain. So we understand that earth is just out here, right? Right? It's a round thing. We're not going to talk about flat earth conspiracy theories right now. But they had their theories back in the day. And part of their theories was that there was a giant space turtle, I guess, that the world was resting upon, and that as the globe turned, that it was resting upon a turtle's back, right? It sounds weird to you, but those were some of the running ideas from the day, from what I understand. Some of you all might remember the Atlas guy, I think that's what his name is, that carries the globe on his back. And Job is making some claims. Now, before telescopes, before anyone had been to space and looked back and taken a photo and sent the pictures back to Earth from the moon that shows how the Earth is literally just hanging in space, Job says that in verse number 7, That he stretched out the north of the empty places, he hangeth the earth upon nothing. That God is here. Now notice what he's saying. God, did you see the subject of verse number 7? He, being God, hangeth the earth upon nothing. Verse number 8, he bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, the cloud is not rent under them. So you've got your typical cloud, the big white fluffy cloud. Anyone want to venture that the average cloud that has rain inside of it, how much do you all think that would weigh? If you weighed the water in there, does anyone know? Anyone want to guess? Anyone online? You can comment in the section right now. Anyone want to venture a guess at all? How many of you all say maybe 5,000 pounds? Nobody? It does fill rivers and lakes. 100,000 pounds. Getting closer? Is that too far? No one's saying anything. You all are awake, right? All right. How many of you all would say 1,000,000 pounds? Is that pretty close? If you say less than 1,000,000 pounds, raise your hand. Okay. If you say more than 1,000,000 pounds, raise your hand. If you didn't vote, you're not participating. The average cloud holds, scientifically, now I don't know this, I had to rely on Google to help me out here, but several places said that the average cloud holds 1.1 million pounds of water. So just picture that. Next time you see a cloud, one of our Oklahoma Thunderhead clouds floating in the sky, that on average, that's 1.1 million pounds of water just floating up there above our heads. And we don't think anything of it, right? But Job did. And here's what Job says, verse number 8. Look at the subject of that verse. It says, he bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent underneath them. So God's power is seen in the earth. Then he goes on to talk about how God's power through the rest of the chapter is seen in the waters. Verse number 9, he holdeth back the face of his throne and spreadeth his cloud upon it. He hath compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He divideth the sea with his power, and by his understanding he smiteth through the proud. By his spirit he hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked serpent. Lo, these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? So here's what Job is saying here in chapter number 26, is that God is powerful, okay? Now remember the two questions. Why are you in this mess? How do you get out of this mess? And Bildad and Elihu and Zophar are all saying, Job, it's because of your sin. It's because of your sin. It's because of your sin. And now we see in chapter number 26, rather than Job just claim his innocence here, he's pointing and saying, but look at the clouds. I'd like to imagine that maybe there were some clouds that were starting to come. Some Oklahoma thunderstorm clouds. You know what I'm talking about? And they were coming through. You can see them on a clear day when that front comes through and see just the majesty of those clouds. And Job is saying, look, God can raise or still the sea at his command. The bounds, it talks about it in verse number 10. He hath compassed the water with bounds until the day and night come to an end. Most people believe that that's talking about the horizon and the sunrise and the sunset. He talks about later on in verse number 11, the pillars of heaven trembled and are astonished at his reproof. What are the pillars of heaven? Most people think that Job is referring to mountains and that God just has to speak for the mountains to quake and for there to be earthquakes. And then verse 12 and 13, God can raise or still the sea at his command, right? So we've seen that in the Bible. Maybe you're thinking of the book of Jonah, right? Jonah's out here running from God, and there's a big storm that comes up, and then the shipmen cast Jonah into the water, and then there's a perfect calm. What's maybe another place where God calms the sea that you all can think of right now? Yes. Yeah, the disciples in the storm, the Sea of Galilee. Remember Jesus is asleep on the boat. The water is so rough that it's starting to toss water overboard or inboard, I should say, and the boat starts to sink. Jesus, carest thou not that we perish? And Jesus stands up and says, peace be still, and the Sea of Galilee is calm. So we see here, and Job wouldn't have had those accounts, but he knew that God was in control of the sea. And in verse 12 and 13, we see that God's power is seen in the serpents. Verse 13, by his spirit he hath garnished the heavens. His hand hath formed the crooked serpent. Lo, these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? So he's talking about how that God makes the serpents, and that these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. The thunder of his power, who can understand? And as I can imagine, Job's 3 friends and then maybe some other people have gathered around at this point. They're listening, but they're kind of just tapping their fingers, saying, all right, Job, get to the point. We already know all these things. All these things, we got it. You've not given us anything we didn't know. But maybe that's important for us to understand there. See, because they knew these things. And Job is not here, if we look, just kind of look through there, from verse number 7, it talks about he, verse number 8, he holdeth back the face, verse number 9, he hath compassed the waters, and verse number 12, he divideth the power, verse 13, by his spirit he hath garnished the heavens, verse 14, lo, these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him, the thunder of his power, who can understand? So what is Job talking about here? Or who is Job talking about? Job is talking about God, right? So he's not just spitting out some information. Job is not being Google here, where Google, you type in the question, and through their algorithm, somehow some sort of relevant answer comes up back most of the time. So if his friends are listening, trying to get more information out of Job, they've not gotten anything they didn't know, but knowledge is not the same thing as understanding. What I believe Job is doing here is he's not talking about the knowledge of God as much as he is the understanding and the wisdom and the power of God. So as Job looks at the weather around him, he doesn't say, oh, that's going to be cold. He doesn't look at the sea and say, well, isn't that interesting how that the sea just doesn't come all the way onto the land, but it stops at a certain point and goes back. He doesn't just hear the thunder and say, well, that's interesting. I wonder how far away the lightning is that struck, like you and I might do from time to time. But he understood that science, or knowledge, we can put it that way, is meant to point back to God. Now, this is really important. That all of the information that Job is declaring in this chapter, it's all done for a very specific reason, and it's pointing back to the glory of God and to God's wisdom and God's understanding. And what Job is doing as he talks about nature and the snakes or the serpents and the horizon and the bounds of the seas and the mountains, he's not just saying, hey, look at that big mountain over there. I'm just a worm and compared to that mountain due to size. No, he's saying, look at how these wonderful aspects of creation glorify and point back to the wisdom and the understanding of God. See, all the nature and creation around us is meant to glorify God. And if science is used to bring about, or if science is used with any motive other than to bring God glory, then eventually it risks coming to the wrong conclusion. All right? So let me put it this way. If you can observe nature and be amazed at the details in nature, then you have gained knowledge. How many of you all remember maybe back in grade school you dissected a frog, or you got a magnifying glass and looked at the minute details of a plant, or of a honeybee, or of an animal or even at our own body. And if you're amazed at the detail, then you've gained knowledge, right? But if you can look at creation and be amazed not at the detail, but be amazed at God, then you've gained understanding. So there's a difference between knowledge and understanding. And what Job is doing is, as he talks about creation and nature and storms and water, he's constantly looking at the things around him and above him and beyond him in the mountains. And he's as he looks at these things, he says it's all pointing back to the knowledge and the understanding, not of science, not of what I have learned, but the knowledge and the understanding of God. Because God is great, is what Job is saying. He's saying God is wonderful in knowledge, and he's vast in understanding. And Job is on the right track here, because for us to understand why we got into a problem and how we're going to get out of a problem, then rather than just focus on the details and on the nitty-gritty things and well, he said this and she responded that way, and my look round out over here, or if they hadn't ratted me out over there. No, rather than look at the details and try to get more knowledge of what happened or why we're here, Job is saying look at the details and then allow that to be a reflection of the creation of God. It's called general revelation. Romans chapter 1 talks about that, and how that God's creation reveals God's goodness. So in all their knowledge of God, we can say this of Job's three friends, that they lacked an understanding of God. In all their knowledge of God, they lacked an understanding of God. Richard Rolle, who lived in the 14th century, he said this: he truly knows God perfectly, that finds him, or God, incomprehensible and unable to be known. So we understand God, and what he's saying here is when we understand that God can't be fully known, that God is vast beyond our knowledge. God is not something that we can just perfectly understand and say, oh, I checked the box, I graduated from seminary, or I went through and I've taught the whole Bible, so now I understand God. But that God is vast beyond our understanding. And God's wisdom is far beyond ours. Not to say that we can't know God, but that we can't ever lose the fact that we ought to be amazed at God. And it also states this, that maybe God's wisdom is beyond mine, and God's understanding is beyond mine. And Job might be saying that there are some things about my circumstance that I don't understand why these things happened, and I don't understand why God would allow these things to happen. But let's look at what he does understand. Chapter number 27, verse number 2 through onward. Let's look at there. As God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty, who hath vexed my soul, all the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips shall not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. God forbid that I should justify you till I die. I will not remove my integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me so long as I live. Before we get there, let me back up just a second and say, in chapter 26, Job is acknowledging the goodness and the greatness of God. Now this is important, okay? Before he goes on to make some important statements in chapter 27, here's what he says. I don't understand some things about my life. I don't have an answer to question number 1. Why am I in this situation? Because Job is staying steadfast, and we'll see this in chapter number 27, that Job is saying, it's not that I've really sinned against God in my heart. That is not the case. So I can't answer emphatically the question of why am I in this situation. But so for question number 1, Job, why are you in trouble? There's still a question mark there. But here's what he did, is he scratched out that question that says, why am I in this situation? And here's what he wrote over that in a red ink pen. He said, God is great, and God is good. And God's understanding is beyond my understanding, and God's wisdom is beyond my wisdom.
Just look around us and be amazed, not at how great nature is, but how great God is. And you know, Job gets some of the answers later on, but let's just park here for a quick second, because there's things that happen in our life, maybe a trial or a storm that comes our way, and we don't get the answer to question number one, do we? Why did this happen? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense why God would allow this to happen. It doesn't make any sense why I'm going through this emotional pain, this family strain, this chronic physical pain, maybe even. I've asked God, and I've got my heart right with God, and God's not shown me that this storm that I'm experiencing is a means of correcting me. I really don't know. Not that I'm without sin, but I really don't know why I'm going through this. And here's what Job is coming to as he answers one of Bildad this final time. As Job is saying, I don't understand. I don't get it. But here's what I do get is God is a lot greater than I'll ever be. And if God can hold over 1 million pounds in the sky over our head, and if God can keep back the bounds of the water, cause the sun to come up and the sun to set, if God can just speak and those mountains way over there will tremble when God speaks, then I've got to rest assured that God is greater than I am. And rather than understand my problem, as I'm drowning in the depths of confusion, I can look up and I can look all around me and I can understand this, that maybe this problem isn't about me finding the answer to why. Maybe this life problem that I'm experiencing is just pointing me to how great God is. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I trust in your spiritual journey that you are coming up, maybe there's been a time when you're coming up on a big life decision. Who you're going to marry. Whether or not you should take this job. Maybe whether or not you should take a Sunday school class. And with major spiritual and life decisions, as you progress, maybe you've been saved long enough that you just understand that it would be a good thing for you to not just pray about it, but also to fast about it, right? So you're going to clear out some things, maybe some distractions. So you're going to not just fast from media and from social networks, and it's not Lent. You're not giving up sinful things. That should be just a part of your normal life. But you're also going to go without food, right? And for a time. And because you're saying this, you're saying that God, there is nothing more important than me getting this direction from you right now. If you can kind of understand or relate, can you shake your head yes, right? So we understand what it is to fast over something. But how often in your spiritual life have you gone to God with a question and maybe seeking an answer from God, but God reveals not the answer to your question, but God just reveals a little bit more about himself? It's been my experience that in my spiritual journey so far, not to brag on myself, but rather to show what God has taught me, that when I've gone to God and fasted and prayed, God, is this the one is this the lady I'm supposed to marry? Is this the direction I'm supposed to go? Is this the job I'm supposed to take? That God, as I fast and as I pray and as I trust you have to or will, that you become aware of sin in your life, but more importantly, you become aware of God in your life. And that rather than seek the answer to our problems, we ought really to be seeking God. It's been what God has taught me in my life. And here's what Job is saying here. That when God throws something your way that you don't understand, that more important than you getting the answer to why, you need to get a better look at who God is and be amazed at God. And let God say, look, I'm bigger than your problems. This isn't about finding the answer. This is about really seeking after God. Job gets pretty emphatic here in chapter 27. As God liveth, verse 2, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul. all the while my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. In other words, in verse 3, as long as I live, my lips, verse 4, shall not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. God forbid that I should justify you. Till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me so long as I live. Let mine enemy be as the wicked, and he that riseth up against me as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he hath gained what when God taketh away his soul? Will God hear his cry when trouble cometh upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? As I said here, Job gets pretty emphatic here in chapter number 27. This is the 5th time in the book of Job that Job has affirmed his integrity and that these things didn't come upon him because of something that he had done. And now for the first time in chapter 27, verse number 2, he makes an oath. Now, for someone to say, as God lived today, it should be, but it's not really that big a deal. People lie under oath all the time, and they get found out about it, and they should be so embarrassed, to say the least, and ashamed whenever they do. But back in this day and time, that was a big deal. Yeah. For you to say, as God liveth, like Job says in verse number 2, that was huge. It would be the same as saying in that day and time in the Eastern people that it was as if when you said, as God liveth, that whatever followed that, if what you said after as God liveth, if that was not true, it's as if you're saying, God, go ahead and kill me if what I'm saying isn't true. That's the power of their oath there. That's the depth of seriousness that Job was taking. This was a hill that Job was willing to die upon. He would not appease his friends and give in to their persuasion. He would not bribe God to get his wealth back. He proclaimed an oath. And then we'll see that he didn't proclaim an oath, but he also reinforced the oath by proclaiming a curse upon those that disagreed with him. Again, as God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul, all the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips shall not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. God forbid that I should justify you. Till I die, I will not remove my iniquity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and I will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me so long as I live. So there's the oath that he makes. Before God, I'm righteous. As God liveth, I'm righteous. I'm not gonna speak iniquity. My lips shall not speak wickedness. My tongue utter deceit. As long as I've got breath in my lungs, breath in my nostrils, I'm gonna stand by this, that this isn't coming upon me because I've sinned. Verse number 7, here's the curse. Let mine enemy be as the wicked, and he that riseth up against me as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite? Though he hath gained, when God taketh away his soul, will God hear his cry when trouble cometh upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? He's saying that this is the penalty for the false accusations that you're making here. That if you're going to stand by the fact that this is because of some great sin in my life, I'm so serious now that I'm going to say, as God liveth, this isn't because of sin. And if you're standing against me, here's the curse that's going to come upon you. And through verse 7 through 10, the curse that he declares here, will God hear his cry when trouble cometh? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call upon God? These are sounding a lot like the accusations that his friends are making against Job. So here's what he's saying. That the penalty, and this would be common in their day, that if you had a false accuser, someone over here, that stands in judgment and says, you have sinned, and because of your sin, God will not hear you, Job. This is literally what's happening. The line in the sand, his three friends on this side, Job on that side. Because of your great sin, God has not heard you. It would be the common thing in that day and time for the false accuser to receive the punishment that they were casting upon the innocent, right? So when we were kids, me and my sisters, we'd say this, that whenever we would try to rat someone out, because that's what kids do, and they snitch on one another, and they tattletale, I think that's the word we use. And sometimes, believe it or not, I honestly, Mom, I didn't do all those things that my sisters told me I did, right? And sometimes they would just make up some things that you did, or maybe sometimes there would be a friend down the street and they'd call you a name or say that you're being dumb. And then as a kid, we would say, whatever you say, you're it, right? You call me dumb? Well, you're actually the dumb one, because whatever you say, you're it. It's the same idea coming over here. Whatever you accuse me of and whatever judgment that you're casting upon me, you're it. So you better be careful. I'm staking a giant claim in this fact that I'm innocent. Now, I want to remind you of this. This is important, and we've got to just keep this in mind, that Bildad had rightly stated that God is just, that God punishes those who disobey him, right? But here's what Job is saying, that just because those things are true of God, that does not mean that everyone who suffers is being punished for their sin, right? So just because there's a storm in life, it doesn't mean that that storm is always a cause of your sin. Now hear me carefully here. Think of Joseph in the Bible. Remember all the storms that Joseph went through? Being sold into slavery, being falsely accused of an affair with Potiphar's wife, and the list goes on and on, being thrown in prison, being forgotten about. And Job could have gone, man, I have just, there must be, what have I done? What sin is this? But Genesis, the second part there, the second half of Genesis, doesn't mention any sin that Joseph had. Not that Joseph was sinless, but it doesn't mention. In fact, it purposefully leaves out that this judgment was because of the sin of Joseph. But what do we see? We see the sin of Potiphar's wife. We see the sin of Joseph's brothers. And the list goes on. So sometimes storms come not because in our lives, not because of our own sin, but because of the sin of other people. Think of Jesus, who Joseph is, in a sense, is a type of Jesus in that he illustrates that he became sin who knew no sin. Jesus suffered not because of his own sin. Jesus was without sin, but because of the sins of other people. All suffering in this life is caused because of sin, but it is not always caused because of the sin of the sufferer. Romans 5:12 kind of reiterates this. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Okay, not everybody ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil like Adam did. Eve was tricked, Adam ate it, right? But because of that sin that Adam took, everyone dies. Now, everyone has sinned also, but in Adam came death. In the first Adam came death. And as time goes on, then not just do we die for our own individual sin, but we die because of a sin nature, right? And that's part of the punishment of sin. So here's another thing we can say. Our world is progressively getting better, right? No. Our world is progressively getting worse. Is it because Pastor has sinned? Pastor has sinned, I think. No, he has. But the riots in Portland are probably not because of some sin that you have done, right? But it's because of the sin of the society. And individual sin, and yes, individual sin brings individual consequences, but sin as a whole degrades our society. That's why Pastor was talking about in Ezra 9, Ezra 10. Remember how Ezra in this prayer, he says, forgive us for we have sinned. Now, Ezra wasn't one of the people that had taken a strange wife, right? But it was the other people that had sinned. And because of the other people that had sinned, there was punishment on the entire group, and there wasn't success. Think of Ai, right? Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, great victory. Next one, 36 people died because 36 people stole Babylonian garments and wedges of gold. No, one person. But because of the sin of one person, multiple people suffer. So death and suffering is caused by sin. But it's not always caused, the particular storm that's in the life is not always caused by the sin of the sufferer. The world is getting worse and worse because of sin, and will continue to get worse. Right? There's theology out there that just says that goodwill and Christendom will prevail till Christ comes back and will usher in the kingdom of God as a bright, flowery world without carbon emissions and all this stuff. But that's not the case. We know that the world will get worse, right, and worse. And then we'll have an Antichrist here before the tribulation, that there's going to be the rapture. And Pastor's talking about this stuff. He'll talk about it more in the morning service, that things will get worse. And as a Christian that understands this, we can look at the riots and at the pandemic, and it just kind of helps our understanding we don't have to be terrified of all these things because we know that that's the natural cause of the curse of sin, right? That things progressively get worse and worse. And so that's something that we need to understand as we go on. But we have to be careful lest when we see people suffer that we don't say that's because of your sin. Let's look here briefly in verse number 11. I will teach you by the hand of God that which is with the Almighty will I not conceal. Behold, all ye yourselves have seen it. Why then are ye this altogether vain? This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage of oppressors, which they shall receive of the Almighty. If children be multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. Those that remain of him shall be buried in death, and his widows shall not weep. Though he heap up silver as the dust, and prepare raiment as the clay, he may prepare it, but the just shall put it on, and the innocent shall divide the silver. He buildeth his house as a moth, and as a booth that the keeper maketh. The rich shall lie down, but he shall not be gathered. He openeth his eyes, and he is not. Terrors take hold of him on him as waters, and a tempest stealeth him away in the night. The east wind carrieth him away, and he departeth, and as a storm hurleth him out of his place. For God shall cast upon him and not spare. He would fain flee out of his hand. Men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. Okay, so there's two thoughts going in here. The three friends are saying, Job, the storm is because of your sin. Job is stating here, kind of as a rebuttal in chapter number 26, I don't understand this. This is not because of a particular sin that I have. I understand that God is great. But by the way, let me point this back to you and say that in your false accusation, there is both punishment upon society and bad things happen to the innocent, if I can put it that way, because of sin. But there's also storms that come in our life and consequences to the particular sins that we have. And God will eventually punish the wicked people. And Job is saying this as a warning to Bildad and his friends that you be careful what you're claiming to be true over here that you don't know to be true. So there will be consequences. So be careful lest in accusing me, you end up accusing yourself and condemning yourself to your own judgment. Real briefly, Pharaoh ordered the Jewish boys to be drowned, right? But what happened? His own firstborn died himself, and the armies of Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, just like Pharaoh drowned the Hebrew children. Haman, Mordecai. Haman is over here, and he tries to get Mordecai in trouble and makes false accusations against Mordecai and builds a gallows for Mordecai. But Haman himself ends up receiving the punishment that he measured out to Mordecai. Daniel's enemies, false accusations, right? And try to get Daniel in trouble and had Daniel thrown in the lion's den. Daniel, this is your punishment for your wickedness that Daniel really didn't have going on at that time. So Daniel, you deserve the lion's den. That's the punishment for you. But those accusers of Daniel had the same punishment. Them and their children and their wives were thrown into the lion's den, and you'll find that in the book of Daniel here. So Job is saying, just be careful. On the day that God vindicates Job, this will happen to Job's enemies. And then briefly, in just a couple minutes left, chapter 28. Here's what he says. This is a very beautifully written, poetic chapter here. He says, surely there is a vein for the silver, and a place for gold where they find it. Iron is taken out of the earth, and brass is molten out of the stone. So we understand what he's talking about here, okay? people mine and they find gold in the earth and silver and iron, right? So Job is saying, if you go to that mountain back there, if you get a chisel and dynamite or whatever the means was of the day, if you dig, you'll find it. You'll find gold. You'll find silver. There's a place where they don't just find gold, but they also find or refine gold. Verse 3, he setteth it into darkness, searcheth out all perfection, the stones of darkness and the shadows of death. The flood breaketh out from the inhabitant, even the waters forgotten of the foot, they are dried up, they are gone away from men. As for the earth, out of it cometh bread. Under it is turned up as it were fire. The stones of it are the place of sapphires, and it hath dust of gold. Okay, so he's saying that in all these things, there's bread that comes up, wheat comes up from the earth. There's a place for that. It comes from the ground. There's a place where gold is found. Now look at verse number 7. There is a path which no fowl knoweth, and which the vulture's eye hath not seen. The lion's whelps have not trodden it, nor the fierce lion passed by it. So he's saying that in all these riches that can be found by man's work, such as finding gold in the mountains and refining it, or sapphire, how that you can just work hard by your own labor and get these things. He's saying, then verse number 7, there's a path, there's a place also to this, a treasure that, in verse number 7, where no fowl, no bird knows where it's at. The vulture's eye hath not seen. The vultures fly in the sky. They look for their treasures that they can find, the rotting carcass of animals, to find that. But he says, no bird knows of this path. The vultures haven't seen this. The lion's whelp haven't trodden it or walked upon it, nor the fierce lion passed by it. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that in all that has happened here, in all that we're trying to find the answers to, that I know that God is great. You be careful about what you're saying. But let me go back to God and say that God knows some things that are past our finding out. That no matter how hard we work for or search for the answer to this question, there are solutions to our problems. There are answers to our questions. That no matter how much we educate ourselves, and no matter how hard we dig in the mountain to find that gold, or no matter how much research we do on the internet, or no matter how many great doctors we seek after, the solution, the treasure we're seeking for, is not found in man. It's past our finding out. But he's saying that there is a path. There is a way to get to that, and the birds can't find it. The lion's whelps haven't found it. They've not trodden upon it. Verse 9, he putteth forth his hands upon the rock. He overturneth the mountains by the roots. He cutteth out the rivers among the rocks, and his eye seeth every precious thing. Notice the he subject in verse 9, 10, verse 11. He bindeth the floods from overflowing, and the thing that is hid bringeth he forth to light. He's saying that though we can't find this by diligent search, and though we've stood around this ash heap that I'm sitting in for hours and days and gone back and forth and still have a big blank in that question, why did all this happen and how are we going to get out of this mess here, that he says there is a solution. There is an answer to the problem. I love it that Job hasn't lost hope yet. And it reminds us of this, that with God there is always hope. No matter how dark the path is, how dark life becomes, no matter how long we've searched and sought for answers, no matter the family situation, the health, the finances, the emotional pain, or the mental struggles that we go through, like depression or anxiety or fear, that there is always hope in God. Let me skip down, just for sake of time, to verse number 28, the last verse in chapter 28. Unto man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. So you've got knowledge, which is just data. It's just information. You've got understanding, and you've got wisdom. So what Job does here is he answers the first and the second question. Why are we in this mess? I don't know, but I know that God is greater. And in my seeking God to find the answer to this problem, I've found that I really ought to be searching God instead of an answer to my problem. Well, how are we going to get out of this problem? Job, how are you going to get your life back together? How are things going to be back to normal again? How are you not just going to die withering away like you are? What's your answer? It's not an answer of knowledge. It's an answer of understanding and wisdom. We don't have time to go into all that, but he says the difference is there. But here's what he says in verse 28. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. So with your big life problem or problems that you're searching for, understand that not all problems can be found by mining out the internet and by searching through other doctors. That sometimes God brings things into our lives that are greater than we'll ever understand. Well, what's the purpose? What's God trying to teach us? What's it going to take to get my family back together? I want to suggest to you this morning as we finish up that education is not your greatest need. For the child that's wayward or rebelling. For the parent that doesn't know how to fix it. For the Christian that doesn't understand this, education is not the answer. The fear of the Lord is wisdom. God's wisdom is your greatest need. Rather than find the answers online, we ought to rather fear God. Fear of God. When you fear God, you walk in his ways. There's scripture, but we don't have time. You obey his commandments. You serve him like Joshua said in Joshua 24:14. You're loyal to God and give him your wholehearted service in 2 Chronicles 19, verse 9. You depart from evil. Proverbs 3, 7, and 8. You overcome fear. Psalms 112. Our life problems doesn't call for greater education, for more hard work. Our life storms ought to bring us to fear God, to walk in his ways. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the great life lessons we find in the book of Job. Lord, it would be irresponsible to claim, Lord, that none of us here are going through a hardship in life. Lord, we know that just as Job warned his accusers, Lord, sometimes you bring things into our life because of our sin. Because we've done something and you love us enough to correct us, to change our course. Lord, sometimes, though, it's not, the storms we're experiencing may not be directly because of a sin that we've caused, but because we need to acknowledge, Father, that you're great. We don't ever understand, Lord, or may never understand the answer to the question why, but we can understand that we do not understand you because you're too great to be understood. What little bit of knowledge we have and understanding we have of you doesn't come from a Google search or watching a movie or some sort of experience, Lord. It comes, the wisdom of our life comes from fearing you, from seeking after you, from obeying your promptings. Lord, how many issues in our life would just be a lot less complicated? How many fears would be dissolved if we just decided that we would trust and fear you? Not to be terrified, but to hold you once more in the place where you belong in reverence. And to glorify you even in the midst of our storms. And to say, I don't understand, but I do know that God is beyond my understanding. God is great. We ought to fear God and obey God. So, Lord, I pray that this lesson this morning would serve as that encouragement, that reminder that in our lives, in our confusion, we don't have to be confused about you, because we know you're great. We know you're majestic. Help us, Lord, to fear you as we ought this morning. We pray these